Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Deborah Lampert-Rudman. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at Morven Museum and Garden, which is right behind me by the magic of Zoom. And I'm just going to do a little quick housekeeping before I introduce you to our host and to our presenter. Quick housekeeping is that tonight we're on a webinar. So please post your questions. At the bottom, you'll see a little Q&A with little thought bubbles. If you could post your questions there, we will have a Q&A following, and you can use the chat for any other technical problems or details. But first, I would like to introduce our host for this evening, Ashley Fermento.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Morven. My name is Ashley Formento, and I'm a member of Morven's Education and Public Programs Committee. And tonight's program is one I'm especially looking forward to. Our speaker, Holly Gruntner, is a scholar who will be talking to us about kitchen gardens. I guess people have been planting for their kitchens as long as there have been kitchens, or cook pots or bowls. And the ordinariness of this endeavor is what makes it so extraordinary. The ingenuity and determination of people to invent ways to feed themselves and their families and communities is remarkable. Close by in Philadelphia, we can visit John Bartram's garden and learn about a remarkable 18th century pioneer in botany. His cutting-edge techniques spread around the world and likely to the planters and gardeners of Morven. Built in the 1750s by Richard Stockton, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Morven in the 18th century featured a kitchen garden, as well as orchards that were maintained by Morven's inhabitants and enslaved people. In the 19th century, Richard's grandson built a greenhouse growing exotics, including citrus fruit. And records show that in the 19th century, a kitchen garden was situated where Morven's parking lot is now. Today, Morven's horticulturalists have created a demonstration garden here with annually changing themes. In addition to culturally unique decorative plantings, more than 1,500 pounds of fresh produce and herbs have been harvested from this garden and donated to the Arm & Arm Food Pantry in the last 2 years. Please come visit Morven this year and explore the grounds and gardens and see what's new. Our online plant sale begins March 14th, so plan to order something for your own garden that you can pick up here in May. As gardeners, when we buy a plant, whether it's a tomato or a peony, we bring home the product of generations of hard work and scientific research, and that's really remarkable. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to Debbie Lampert-Rudman for making tonight's program possible.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that warm welcome. I am so delighted to be able to introduce tonight's Early American Kitchen Gardens and Gardeners presenter. It's such a timely topic as we head into spring, and we are so fortunate to have Holly Gruntner with us tonight. Holly is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. She earned her MA from William & Mary in 2017 and has a BA from the University of Minnesota Morris. Her dissertation project is entitled Fertile Ground, Kitchen Gardens, and Knowledge Production in Early America. Her work focuses on how horticultural knowledge was made and exchanged in early America from about 1700 through 1830. Ashley Fermento brought Holly's work to my attention since she found it so enlightening and relatable to Morven's kitchen garden. And I am thankful to Ashley and delighted to bring Holly to your attention as well tonight. Again, please be sure to post any questions you may have in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Holly Gruntner.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Debbie and Ashley, for those wonderful introductions. And thank you to others at Morven for having me. I'm really delighted to be in this virtual Morven space to talk about a piece of my dissertation work today. And I want to just echo, if you haven't already visited Morven or explored their online resources, I highly encourage you to do so if you're interested in garden history or early American history. The resources online and certainly at the museum are really rich. So, as Debbie outlined, I specialize in early American history, especially of the mid Atlantic and northeastern seaboard in the long 18th century, which is kind of my sort of cheater way to say that I want to study the 18th century, but I also want to go a few decades into the 19th century. So, I go to about 1830. My PhD dissertation again focuses on kitchen gardens and horticultural knowledge. And the subjects of my dissertation are non elite people, that is, people who were of lower classes, who were enslaved, or who were indentured. And I came to this interest in gardens and gardening in part because of the larger questions that this focus allows me to ask about the past. Um, the productive vegetables, fruit, and herb focused gardens I study were everywhere in early America, and many early Americans had a hand in tending to them. In studying gardens and gardening, then, I can think about what the details of everyday work were in early America for many early Americans. Of course, understanding that those details could be vastly different depending on someone's status, geographic location, gender, age, etc., which I'll talk more about throughout this lecture. Now, no one who has gardened before, and I know that many in this virtual room have gardened before, no one who has gardened before will be surprised to hear that gardening in the 18th century was, similarly to today, a complex process that demanded experience and trial and error, and was still subject to sometimes heartbreaking contingencies such as weather or bug infestations. So, in studying kitchen gardens, I didn't only want to study the intricacies of gardening, though that is certainly part of my project, but I also wanted to know how knowledge worked in early America by understanding how horticultural knowledge and work was shared between households, between neighbors, in communities, and in wider economic and horticultural networks. Now, the problem with asking these questions and wanting to study these kinds of gardens is, of course, that for the most part, we no longer have above ground gardens from the 18th century. Archaeologists and archaeobotanists are able to use garden structure and botanical remains to draw conclusions about past gardens and people's relationships to plants. And we have public historians like the ones at Morven and horticulturalists who research, recreate, and interpret historic gardens. This is the demonstration garden at Morven, which is set up in the style of a kitchen garden and has a rotating horticultural theme. But what happens when this is the site of your study? So I took these photographs in January 2022 in Annapolis, Maryland. And if you're familiar with Annapolis and wondering why there's so much snow on the ground, this was right after the big snowstorm that shut down I-95 in January. And this parking lot is of interest to me because this is the former site of the Ferris Household Garden. It is on a piece of land that belonged to a man named William Ferris from 1761 to 1804. Now, I don't show you this parking lot to knock the city of Annapolis for not saving the Ferris House and Garden, because overall, again, if you've been to Annapolis, you know that Annapolis has done a really wonderful job preserving historic sites that tell us a great deal about what life was like in early Maryland. But properties change hands and things aren't always preserved. And even the Morven Gardens, as many of you probably know, transformed in dramatic ways over the years as different people lived in the house. In fact, I believe, and I confirmed this just before my talk, that one of the things the Morven staff and I have in common is that our 18th century historic kitchen garden is currently underneath a parking lot, and we've had to sort of think creatively to recreate what that space might have looked like. So my talk today, relatedly, is about how I use archival sources to reconstruct the work that took place in this no longer existent garden space in Annapolis, Maryland. So what was here before the parking lot? We don't have any surviving images of the Ferris Garden as a whole, but we can piece together some details from William Ferris's diary and other surviving records. This is a plot of the Ferris lot in Annapolis with a few of my embellishments to kind of show you where things were. As you can see, the front of the property at the top of this image was on West Street. And this is a photo that I took of West Street this past January. West Street was and is a busy thoroughfare in early Maryland. The Ferris household was close to Church Circle, which is where St. Anne's Parish was and remains to this day. In this photograph, which was taken roughly from where the Ferris house would have been, you can see the steeple of St. Anne's Church just down the road there. The Ferris household was also just a few blocks from the Annapolis State House and a short walk from the harbor and the market space in Annapolis. The house, which also contained the Ferris Tavern and may have been connected to the Ferris silversmith, watchmaking, and clockmaking shop, sat right against West Street, as you can see in this picture. But the back of the property, where the Ferris's stable was against Cathedral Street, and you can see that in the bottom left of the image. And so in between these structures, the house on Cathedral Street, the house on West Street, excuse me, and the stable against Cathedral Street, we have the garden. And the garden would have been visible from the street, both in the front and the back of the property, while the sides of the property, though fenced, would have been visible to the Ferris's neighbors. So through the gate on West Street at the front of the property, passersby would have been able to peer down the garden's main aisle, beholding a neat maze of boxwood shrubs and flower beds. Trees, including walnut, holly, willow, and peach trees, shaded several patches of the garden, while a statue would have made an elegant impression. From the gate at the back of the garden on Cathedral Street, passersby would have witnessed a different aspect of the garden. Here were several large vegetable beds, a portion of the garden William Ferris called the lot to distinguish it from the more scenic flower garden. Now, as I mentioned, the Ferris family lived on this property, but many other people lived on the property as well. It was the Ferris family, the people they enslaved, their indentured servants, and paid laborers who lived and worked in this space. William Ferris, the head of the household, was a middle-class silversmith, clockmaker, and watchmaker. And the reason that we know so much of this information is because William Ferris kept a diary. He began this diary on January 1st, 1792. Like today, the new year in early America was a time to start diaries, even if you didn't keep up with them for more than a month. But William Ferris did keep his New Year's resolution, and he wrote in this diary almost daily for 12 years, stopping a few days before his death in August 1804. In this diary, Ferris recorded a vast array of happenings. He wrote of local events and elections, births and deaths, conflicts with his children and the weather, and almost every day Ferris wrote about the garden and the gardeners who labored there. Other historians have written about William Ferris's role in imagining and shaping the Ferris Garden, but I realized that using the same diary, I could learn a lot about other people who contributed to the garden. And I want to start introducing you to this diary and this garden with a particular passage from William Ferris's diary that illustrates just how many people were working in this space. This is a diary entry from March 24th, 1794, in William Ferris's own words and using his spellings. These are not my mistakes, I promise. This is how he spelled things. It was a fine day, William Ferris wrote in his diary, made even finer by the fact that spring seemed to have permanently set in. It had been a typical winter in Annapolis, Maryland, though a memorable late January storm had blown down an old structure on a neighbor's property, rendering one of his cows mashed, in the words of William Ferris. Several members of the Ferris household were out in the garden on this March day, surveying the muddy beds and budding tulips and beginning the spring garden tasks. Ferris wrote, for example, that while he dug trenches in one of the garden beds, one of his daughters, 16-year-old Becky, sowed the peas in the holes he had dug. Silva, an enslaved woman who was owned by the Ferrises, followed behind Becky with a handful of pea sticks or stakes. Silva placed stakes in between the pea plants. These would support the vines as they grew. A man William Ferris had hired named Bob came between 7 or 8 o'clock to work in the garden as well. In the front of the garden, Becky's brother Hiram Ferris worked at, quote, making up the table round the bed. This referred to the garden's complex irrigation system. Frequently, the ditches for water that went around certain plant beds in the garden would become clogged with dirt, plant clippings, or other debris. Errant footsteps could also crush parts of this ditch system. So part of Hiram's task here was to remove debris from the irrigation ditches, but part of his task also may have involved making sure that the raised plant beds in the garden remained raised, using a trowel or a shovel to sort of build them back up. Hiram also troweled the flower beds. This troweling would have loosened the soil that had been packed down firmly by winter snow, rain, and freeze, and prepared it for planting. When Ferris left to run an errand, Bob seized the opportunity to absent himself as well. Ferris grumpily wrote later that, quote, Silva went to taking up the balm, which I had told Bob to do. Balm referred probably to bergamot balm, a flower that many today also know as bee balm. Ferris later replanted the balm, perhaps moving it from one part of the garden to another. So there's a lot going on in this one diary entry, right? So here I've highlighted the different names so you can see just how many people are at work here. You can see, of course, that we're talking about various people, but we're also talking about people of varying statuses. So we have William Ferris, who is this middle-class man. He enslaved some of the people working in the garden. He was a supervisor. He was enforcing the gardening activities that were taking place. Ferris's children, Becky and Hiram, were also at work in the garden, as well as Silva, a woman enslaved by the Ferrises. And then we have Bob, who was hired by the Ferrises to do some work on this day. So he is the one here who isn't a permanent member of the household. And these different people were performing various tasks among various plants. Some tasks were in tandem, such as William Ferris digging trenches for the peas while Becky planted them and Silva placed pea stakes. Some tasks were individual, such as Hiram working on the water table and troweling the flower beds. There was also some conflict, according to William Ferris's account at least, when Bob left the garden and Silva had to finish Bob's task. Bob's actions remind us that the Ferris Garden wasn't a peaceful middle-class haven, that in the garden, as in other workspaces in early America, work and knowledge expression were frequently driven by conditions of status, race, and class, and were resisted in turn. So, as this diary entry illustrates, the Ferris household wasn't only a domestic space or a space that was only the home of blood relatives. So, I really wanted to lay out exactly who is in this household before I start to dig into the garden a little more, not to make a pun there. So, the Ferris household included the Ferris family, so William Ferris and his wife Priscilla and their children. It included people who were enslaved by the Ferrises, Silva, who you've met, and her children, Charity and Adam. It included servants, artisans, apprentices, and laborers who worked in the house, workshop, and in the garden, including some who were hired for specific horticultural work, such as Bob, and an enslaved man named William, who you'll hear about later in this talk. The household also hosted many customers and visitors because the household contained many businesses. I've already mentioned the silversmith shop. Out of this shop, William Ferris also ran a carpentry shop. He pulled teeth occasionally in this space, we think. There was a tavern connected to the Ferris house. There was also a tulip nursery in the garden. William Ferris and other gardeners working there grew a great variety of tulips, and Annapolis residents could come in the spring when the tulips were blooming to kind of choose the varieties that they wanted to purchase for their own gardens. The Ferrises also made money by offering overflow seating for the theater next door. So there were a lot of people who moved in and out of the Ferris household for a variety of business and work reasons. And of course, this didn't even include people who were just in this space to pay social calls or to make social visits. So, of these groups of people in the household, a really large portion worked in, around, or provided materials for the Ferris Garden. In fact, a staggering 116 people, by my count, had a hand in the Ferris Garden just between 1792 and 1804. So, my first task in analyzing the Ferris Diary was to find a way to make sense of all of these different people and their contributions to the garden. I want to explain in short how I went about transforming diary entries like this into a data set that allows me to draw deeper conclusions about the garden and gardeners. In his diary, William Ferris tended to describe garden labor in a series of actions. So he would use the same word or phrase over and over to describe a task. And you can see this is part of my data set. This purple row going across the top includes some of those phrases that Ferris used. He would use phrases like taking up throughout his diary. Taking up meant that someone was harvesting, moving plants, or removing dead vines or stalks from a garden bed. He would use the phrase opening up to describe removing insulators from plants and garden beds. So removing the straw or the glass domes that had been placed there to sort of protect the plants from the cold weather in the early spring. Now, note that William Ferris does not say in his diary exactly what these phrases mean. He doesn't really define them for us, but through deduction, I was able to figure out what he means by most of these phrases. So what I did was I took those key phrases and used them to create categories of work. So again, that purple row going across the top of my table includes those different categories. And then I made a column on the left side of the table for each gardener who did something in the Ferris Garden, brought a seed to the Ferris Garden, and counted how many times each person performed one of these tasks in the garden, and tried to include, as you can see with the example of Silva that I have on the screen in front of you, I tried to include as much detail as I could about what plants each gardener was working with, who they were working with, where they were in the garden. And then this is a more simplified version of the table. This is not the whole thing. I couldn't squeeze it onto one slide. So this is just the brass tacks numbers and some of the people included. The names highlighted in green are people who were enslaved or hired to work in the garden, which allows me this color coding, and I do more color coding, but I've spared you most of it. But this allows me to see clearly how gardeners of different statuses were working in and moving through the space. Now, my data shows really powerfully, I think, that although much of what we know about the Ferris Garden comes from William Ferris's diary, this garden space, which was much more than a result of William Ferris's imagination, management, or labor, and on a more granular level, transforming this diary into a data table like this allows me to zoom in on one gardener at a time to analyze their labors. And that's what I want to give you a few examples of today, starting with Silva and her work in the garden. And specifically, I want to talk about the category of work that Silva did the most often, which William Ferris referred to simply as digging. You can see that huge column on the left there. That is just the digging column, and I even had to cut some of it off to fit it in the slide. So Silva was enslaved by the Ferrises from at least 1791 until at least 1810, according to surviving records. Silva had two children that we know of, a daughter named Charity and a son named Adam, who were also enslaved by the Ferrises. And Silva was one of the most consistent and important laborers in the garden throughout the years of Ferris's diary, which is why I wanted to make sure to talk about her today. In fact, it's really difficult to overemphasize Silva's crucial role in the Ferris Garden. She performed 309 different tasks in the garden during the years of Ferris's diary keeping, second only to William Ferris himself, who performed 414. So far and away, William Ferris and Silva were the most productive gardeners in this garden. Ferris began his diary, as I said, on January 1st, 1792, and Silva first appears in the diary on May 1st of that year. May 1st was also the first instance of Silva digging in the garden. She went on, however, to dig on 138 different days, represented by the large blue portion of this chart. As you can see, Silva performed nearly 70% of the recorded digging that happened in the Ferris garden. So she dug a lot. But what exactly does Ferris mean when he describes a task as digging, and why does it matter that Silva performed this task so frequently? Well, digging in Ferris's shorthand likely referred to a combination of tasks. So Silva would have broken up tough clods of packed soil into a loose, even texture. Digging also involved turning or stirring the soil to aerate it. In the winter months before sowing season, digging could both prepare the soil for planting as well as expose the earth to frost, which could, people believed, bring additional nutrients into the soil. Digging was also required to mix fertilizers into the soil, such as dung or tan, which I'll talk a little more about later. According to Charles Marshall in Introduction to Knowledge and Practice of Gardening, which is pictured on the left, this was one of the gardening manuals that people of William Ferris's class and higher would have had access to. According to Marshall, digging was vital. Gardens gained, quote, a free, sweet, and rich soil by proper digging to forward well-flavored productions. So essentially, digging made your veggies taste better, Marshall claimed. Philip Miller agreed with this. His popular gardener's calendar, pictured on the right, advised gardeners to dig that ground at all leisure times, laying it in trenches, which will be of great service in sweetening and mellowing the ground, and then it will always be ready for sowing and planting. Silva's near constant digging tracks with this advice. Some gardeners use plows and oxen to break up the soil in larger gardens. Others used hoes, pitchforks, spades, shovels, pickaxes, or even clamshells. This is an illustration of enslaved women working with hoes in Fredericksburg, Virginia, around 1798. You can see the overseer is pictured supervising on the left. And while I don't claim that this is exactly what the scene in the Ferris Garden would have looked like, I think that this image demonstrates the posture Silva may have used when wielding a hoe or a shovel. Silva may have also used a gardening claw or rake like this one to dig. This is a wrought iron gardening claw in the Colonial Williamsburg collections. I had to bring Williamsburg in somehow. William Ferris's 1805 probate inventory, which was the list of items in his household after he died, also listed 2 trowels and, quote, sundry garden tools among his possessions. Silva may have used some of these for different types of digging. Notably, and here's a picture of the probate on the left and then 3 excerpts that I've pulled out of it. Notably, although not uncommonly, the inventory listed Silva herself as part of these possessions, lumping her in with the other tools used in the Ferris Garden and valuing her, as you can see in this sort of thin rectangle in the top one. Silva was valued at $60 according to this probate. And to give you some perspective, a chime clock among Ferris's possessions was valued at $100 in this same probate. So this is, of course, a really sobering example of how Silva and other enslaved people were treated and listed in documents like this as if they were tools or possessions instead of people. Often, Silva's digging was accompanied by immediate planting. And I think this is an important point in understanding more about what digging looked like and who Silva would have choreographed her efforts with. In several instances, Ferris associates her digging with specific plants. So Ferris would write that Silva was digging for parsnips or for beans. In these cases, Silva would have needed to calculate how deep, wide, and spaced apart each trench needed to be depending on the plant that would grow there. In a related instance, a hired girl, Ferris calls her a girl, of African descent named Henny planted parsnips in Ferris's garden in 1797. And this is in the top white rectangle. You can see this passage. Ferris must have been watching Henny or reviewing her work pretty closely because he wrote exactingly in his diary that the parsnips were planted in lines 9 inches apart and seed 7 inches from seed to seed. Almost always, digging needed to be a choreographed effort, coordinated with other laborers in the garden. Often, this involved Silva priming the ground for William Ferris to plant seeds or cuttings. In 1799, for instance, Ferris recorded that Silva had finished digging the ground for the vines, which had been a 2-day effort on Silva's part, and then Ferris planted the vines. You can see this in the bottom rectangle. Ferris planted 13 hills of simlins, which were a type of summer squash, 7 hills of cantaloupes, and 6 hills of cucumbers. This graph reveals just how dramatically different Silva's garden chores were from William Ferris's. William Ferris is represented by the blue bars and Silva by the orange bars. It is clear from the graph that Ferris was doing almost everything Silva was not, and vice versa. The bars representing Ferris's tasks almost always correspond to non-existent or small bars for Silva, and vice versa. In the planting and digging categories, we see the strongest discrepancy. William Ferris's garden work, of that he recorded in his diary, was overwhelmingly planting. There's also a discrepancy in where different laborers worked in the garden. Silva performed the majority of her digging at the back of the Ferris garden, where the large-scale vegetable beds were. I can show you this image again. Silva was kept working among the productive, if still vitally important part of the garden, instead of among the tulips or the other flowers at the front of the garden. Now, this difference is certainly worthy of our attention. Silva's workspace may have reflected a decision William Ferris made about how he wanted the vista of his flower garden to look from the bustling West Street. Certainly, such a decision would have shaped Silva's own experiences in the garden. But we might also view Silva's labor space within the garden as indicative of her skills, in addition to her race and status. Of the plants we know Silva worked with in the Ferris garden, she most frequently worked among peas, parsnips, asparagus, and beans. Regardless of whether these were her specialties when she first began to work in the Ferris garden, they certainly would have become so over time as she repeatedly performed the same work among the same vegetables year after year. The Ferris household relied heavily on Silva's specialized labors, so much so that, as I've already pointed out, it was a really rare occasion when someone else in the household duplicated her tasks. Understanding the irreplaceable importance of Silva's contributions to the Ferris garden also helps us to see the loss to the garden's productivity, quite literally to the household and the tavern's food supply, when Silva was unable to or refused to work. It's difficult to imagine that Silva's absence from the garden could have been anything but deeply disruptive to the rhythm of labors. And clearly William Ferris realized this as he painstakingly recorded each of Silva's absences and returns to the garden in his diary. Silva, for her part, may have made choices within the confines of her enslavement about when she was going to work and when she was not going to. She certainly would have realized how much the household depended on her and may have negotiated her work as much as she was able to. Now, to supplement the labors of members of the Ferris household, as I mentioned, William Ferris frequently hired free and enslaved people to work in the garden. And I want to next turn to talking about one of these laborers, which allows me to also talk about the ways in which the Ferris garden was part of a wider horticultural community. Over the course of his diary's record, Ferris mentioned 25 people who he hired to perform horticultural tasks. Some gardeners Ferris hired were enslaved by his neighbors. Other hired laborers in the Ferris garden were free Black Annapolitans who had much more autonomy to make their own decisions about how to hire their time and at what rate. As this graph reveals, temporarily hired laborers seem to have most often performed labors that required strength and power, like pushing heavy wheelbarrows of dung through the garden and shoveling that dung onto the plant beds. Notably, these tasks didn't require workers Ferris may not have yet trusted to handle delicate live plants. But this doesn't mean that these hired laborers didn't make valuable and unique contributions to the Ferris garden. In many instances, we see through the diary that hired workers brought keen expertise into the garden. And at least sometimes, Ferris was deliberately seeking out laborers who he perceived to have horticultural knowledge or physical capability for specific tasks. And we can see this expertise on the part of hired laborers and their extended relationships with the Ferris household garden, perhaps most clearly through the example of an enslaved man named William. Now, I know this is a lot of Williams and there's a third one coming. So from now on, I'll just distinguish between the two Williams. I'll call Ferris William Ferris, and without knowing his surname, this enslaved man I'll call William. William Ferris hired William to perform various garden labors in and for the Ferris Garden. William was enslaved by Richard Ridgely, who was an Annapolis lawyer and politician. And as far as we know, William's first brush with the Ferris Garden was in February 1799, when William Ferris wrote in his diary that, quote, "William, a black man, brought me a holly tree." Now, it's unclear where the holly came from for sure, although William likely procured the holly from nearby woods, walking through the trees until he found a tree that was the right shape, size, and level of health to transport and transplant and to suit William Ferris, who may have given him specifications for what he wanted. Perhaps William had found the moisture-loving holly trees near a body of water on the outskirts of town. He may have walked toward the Severn River or to one of the smaller creeks bordering Annapolis to the north and south. He may have instead turned inland, perhaps following the road to Baltimore that I've circled on this map, this 1781 map of Annapolis made by Lafayette's cartographer during the Revolutionary War. On this map, the inland areas of the peninsula are heavily forested. You can kind of see the dark smears on the right corner of the map. That's meant to represent the forest. Holly trees are native to the Chesapeake watershed region. Only female holly trees grow those famous wintry red berries that you can see pictured on my slide, which first ripen in September and are on the tree through December and even sometimes longer into the winter. If William Ferris requested a tree that bore berries, or indeed if he requested a male tree that did not, it was probably not accidental that William Ferris fetched one in the winter while the berries were still visible. It was a cloudy day when William Ferris, probably helped by William and others, planted the tree William had brought next to the outhouse in the garden, which William Ferris called, quote, "the little house in the garden," which I think is a very nice term for outhouse. The holly would have lent its thick evergreen trees to the small grove of flowers and trees meant to shield the outhouse from the rest of the garden and from the house. At one point, William Ferris wrote of having a holly tree flanking each side of the walk leading to the outhouse, and he had grafted white roses onto one holly tree and red roses onto the other. So he really went above and beyond to make things look nice in this area of the garden. William used his expertise finding and digging holly trees a few more times as recorded in the diary. He brought William Ferris 2 more trees in 1799 and 1800. The second tree was also planted by the outhouse, and the third was planted, quote, "where the other had stood." So this tree was perhaps replacing one of the previous holly trees which had died. But we might also view this sort of second round of holly trees that William brought into the garden as a kind of trial and error. Female holly trees do not bear much fruit unless a male tree is present to fertilize it. Typically, one male tree needs to be present for every 3 female trees. William may have realized this and adjusted the proportions of the sexes in the Ferris garden accordingly. Beyond the holly trees, William became something of a fixture in the Ferris garden. Many times he brought manure from the stables of his enslaver Richard Ridgely's tavern, mixing it with tanner's bark and spreading it onto the Ferris garden beds. William's contribution of the tanner's bark for fertilizer is actually the only recorded use of the bark in William Ferris's diary, which seems like strong evidence to me that this was a technique that William specifically was bringing into the Ferris garden. According again to Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, which is pictured on the right, tan or tanner's bark is the bark of the oak tree chopped and ground into coarse powder to be used in tanning or dressing of skins, after which it is of great use in gardening. So essentially, the way that the tanning process worked with this bark was that oak bark or hemlock, often if you were in a part of the United States where hemlock trees grew, this bark was shredded and soaked in hot water until its tannins were released. If you've heard the word tannin before, it might have been in reference to wine allergies. Tannins are a kind of plant astringent or acid. That some people are allergic to, and it occurs on the skin of red grapes. And so that's why wine can be a problem for some people. But tannin was really excellent for tanning animal hides because it helped to waterproof them and to keep them from rotting. So after these animal hides were soaked with the bark and hot water, farmers and gardeners were really eager to use this leftover wood pulp as fertilizer. When applied to a garden bed, according to some of these gardening manuals, tan released a moderate heat and very little steam, which compared to animal dung actually, according to some people again, worked better as fertilizer. Like the holly trees, the tanner's bark William contributed tells us something about William's network and travels in and beyond Annapolis in pursuit of items for the Ferris garden. Through Ferris's diary, we can trace William's horticultural journeys to and from the Ridgely Tavern and Garden, the Ferris Household, the wooded outskirts of town, and also to and from a tannery to retrieve this bark. Now, tanneries at this point in time when William would have been going to and from them were actually on the outskirts of Annapolis due to the, quote, intolerable stench of animal carcasses and their drying hides. All tanning operations were banned from Annapolis during the Revolutionary War by the Annapolis Council of Safety. And I believe this is actually a pretty common thing. I think a lot of cities and towns in early America kind of put their foot down and said, nope, let's get the tanneries out of town. They're too smelly. So perhaps William had a connection to the tanner Philemon Brown, whose tannery, as you can see from this ad, was outside of Annapolis. Philemon Brown advertised in the Maryland Gazette in 1793 that his tan yard was not only for sale, but that it was in a good neighborhood for getting bark, meaning that it was in a heavily forested area, perhaps where William had fetched the holly trees. Now, as unglamorous as these tanneries certainly were, and as unglamorous as the outhouse shielding holly trees may have been, they notably endured for years as the last lingering above ground representations of Ferris's garden. In order to contextualize this and contextualize William's work, I want to zoom forward in time a ways to Annapolis circa 1920. This is a photograph, again, taken around 1920, according to the archival collection it's in at the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis. And I know it's hard to see. I really tried my best, but this was as clear as I could get it. This is a photograph of 3 children standing underneath a large holly tree. Now, it would be difficult to identify this as a holly tree from the photograph alone, but on the back is written, quote, holly tree in McParlin's yard, as you can see on the right photograph. Billy McParlin was an apprentice in the Ferris silversmith shop until William Ferris's death. And I talk about Billy McParlin and his role in the garden in my dissertation, but I'll just say here that upon William Ferris's death, McParlin ran the Ferris shop himself, and eventually he purchased the Ferris house and property. McParlin lived on the property until his death in 1850, but his descendants lived there until the early 1920s, around the time when the home was destroyed and around the time that this photograph was taken. A 1941 essay by Lockwood Barr in the Maryland Historical Magazine kind of corroborates that this holly tree was still standing and was from the original Ferris Garden. Barr claims that this one holly tree was, quote, all that remains of the Ferris Garden. As of 1941, Barr writes, the tree was, quote, more than 4 feet in diameter and stood over 50 feet high, which seems very tall for a holly tree, but they can grow up to 60 to 80 feet tall, although it takes a long time for them to get that big. The article also writes that Billy McParland told his descendants that Ferris transplanted from the woods before 1800 a dozen or more small holly trees, which were his pride and joy, and that he kept these trees trimmed, quote, like a sugar loaf. So, of course, now we know that it was not Billy McParlin or William Ferris, but another William who was responsible for these transplants, and that the tree in the photograph, which according to local lore, this holly tree wasn't actually taken down until 1985, this tree that was the last lingering above ground piece of the Ferris Garden was found and planted by an enslaved man named William. So I think we can kind of do a better job now filling in this parking lot, if you can allow me a little cheesiness. So in conclusion, the example of Silva's digging and William's holly tree and tan errands are just a few examples from my dissertation chapter about the Ferris Garden. I hope that my talk has shown what we can learn when we break down seemingly simple or merely repetitive garden labors such as digging and analyze the patterns of work and knowledge these labors represent. From the example of William, we learn that household gardens' reach expanded far beyond their fences. Gardens could also be the product of a community of laborers and part of wider geographic and ecological networks as well. Something so simple as finding and planting a holly tree was imbued with social networking, observation, and experimentation. I want to thank you again for your time and attention, and I'm so eager to answer your questions. I will turn it over to Debbie to run the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Holly. This was, I mean, you had a way of turning data into the most interesting and intriguing mystery story and history story, just wonderful. So thank you. We're all applauding right now for that. The first question I had here that was sent to me is, what made you interested in this topic for your dissertation?
Sure. So, well, thank you for the question, first of all. And I think I have been asked that before, and people often want to know if I garden myself. And my answer is that I do not, because I live in a tiny apartment with a little patio right now, but I look forward to being able to experiment myself. But I think I came to this research not from a love of gardening, but because I was so interested in lower class people's knowledge in early America. And I started to really think about how I could understand their intellectual lives given what sources are left to us today. And I thought that gardens, that a kind of daily work and a project that so many early Americans had going on would be a really good way to get at a lot of intellectual life in early America. And I found it to be really interesting.
Thank you for that. Next question. Do you know whether tomatoes were planted in the garden? Also, what types of supports were used?
Sure. So tomatoes, I believe there were tomatoes, and I suspect, thank you for this question. I suspect that the person asking maybe knows that there was a little bit of stigma surrounding tomatoes in early America. And so a lot of people did not grow them. They did not become the kind of garden staple they are today until much later. But I believe William Ferris did grow tomatoes in his garden, and he would have used, if by support you're talking about tomato stakes, he probably would have used wooden stakes or wooden structures in order to support their growth.
Thank you. So another question, how big was the garden area?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know a lot about how big it was. The plot allows us to kind of imagine, but we don't have the exact numbers for the size of the plot. I can't I don't think I feel confident enough to give you like a square footage estimate, but I hope I've demonstrated that there really was a lot in the garden. There was a house, there was the stable, there were all these different beds. So it really was a pretty big space. It was a narrow space, but it was long, stretching between those streets. If you look at the I can kind of go back to my parking lot picture. I've kind of been imagining that this is roughly the size of what the garden would have been, if that's helpful for you, but we don't know for sure.
Thank you for that. What is meant by trimmed like a sugar loaf?
Sure. So good question. And I can answer this really well because there's a big holly tree that's right off my patio that is trimmed like a sugar loaf. And what that means is that it was kind of a rounded triangular shape. So it was a soft rounded triangle. And sugar cones, that was the way that you would buy sugar in early America. It was always purchased in the shape of kind of a rounded triangular cone. So that's why the comparison to the sugar cone was made.
Oh, interesting. That's another question here. They popping up. What were the most common plants in the garden?
Sure. So I would say probably similar plants to those that were common in a lot of early American gardens. A lot of peas, a lot of beans, the flowers. William Ferris, who I don't talk as much about William Ferris as I talk about other people, and that is because other historians have really written rich studies of Ferris himself. But the flower garden that William Ferris spent a lot of time tending to had all of these tulips, all of these varieties of tulips. He had a number of other flowers that would have been considered kind of rare or exotic in early America. But in the back garden, yeah, I would say that for vegetables, it was definitely peas and beans. Um, One thing that you might be interested to know is that the Ferrises weren't growing things like potatoes or corn because those they were buying from the local market. So they weren't growing those themselves. But I would say peas and beans were probably the most common.
Oh, interesting. Um, so the other thing is, what is next for you? This is, you say this is part of your PhD candidacy. So what is next with this data and your PhD progress?
Thank you for asking. Sometimes I wonder that myself. So this, what I've presented on today is from, I think I mentioned one chapter in my dissertation. The dissertation will eventually have 5 chapters, so I'm still writing the thing. I've written 3 chapters so far, and I'm thinking it'll probably take me about another year to finish up the writing and the revisions. And I'm not sure what I hope to do with this data next. It depends on what kind of job that I get after grad school. I'm really interested in a job that allows me to do some teaching. So I would like to teach at a college level or to be part of an education program at a museum. So hopefully there will be opportunities for me to keep presenting on this work in those capacities, maybe to publish a book. I'm not sure. Thank you for asking again.
I think this may be our final question. So how hard was it for you to find primary sources?
Yeah, thank you for asking. That is often a challenge. I have to say, I was so lucky for this, for sources for this piece of my research because I was trying to write this chapter during the pandemic when I couldn't travel to all of these archives. And so Mark Letzer and Jean Russo have actually edited William Ferris's diary, and you can buy it as a book. And they have all the diary entries transcribed, and they've inserted a lot of really interesting information into that book as well. So I was able to use that version of the diary. But recently in January, when I took the parking lot picture, I was at the Annapolis, the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis, and I also went to the Maryland Society for History and Culture, which is in Baltimore. And those are the two main hubs where the primary sources for this chapter are. Those are the hubs that have like the Ferris account books, the original diary, the photograph that I showed you of the holly tree. But a lot of the primary source work that I've been doing in order to contextualize this information, as you might have noticed, has been to kind of bring in other sources that I think help me understand the Ferris Garden. So I've been looking at newspapers that were published in this area during the time of the diary. Um, I've looked at gardening manuals from the day, which I also showed you to kind of help me make sense. So I will say, as far as primary sources go, it hasn't been too bad. I will say that something that continues to be disappointing is that there really aren't any sources that tell me anything more about Silva or William, other than what I mentioned. Silva, what we know about her is primarily from William Ferris's diary. So I'm on the hunt for something else that mentions her, but that's the main source for understanding Silva's life.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we do have, these are the two final questions. What would you ask William if you had the chance? And I guess he means William, not William Ferris, or I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure which William.
I think I would, boy, I really want to know a lot. I think for my research questions, I would be so interested to learn from William about how he learned to garden, how he learned to find these holly trees, how he learned about what kinds of fertilizers worked and how to get access to that fertilizer. I'm always interested in how people in early America knew what they knew. So I would have a lot of questions for him about that.
And a reminder, everyone, we will be sending out a recording of this entire wonderful program to you following. So final question, did he grow herbs? Some commonly planted in that time period and era. I've heard of lovage and borage.
Thank you for that question. He did. There were herbs grown in the garden. There was actually a pretty big variety of herbs. And again, that published version of William Ferris's diary that I mentioned actually has some good appendices that describe all of the things grown in the Ferris garden. So it lists all the herbs. I know that there were a variety, and I know that some of these herbs were used in the household for making teas, for healing, for seasoning. This was even though this was a very large kitchen garden, it was still a kitchen garden. So the Ferris family wanted, and other gardeners wanted to grow things that they could actually use in the household. So certainly herbs were there.
So there is one final question now, because this may be of importance to those who want to visit this area. How close is West Street to Duke of Gloucester? How close is this property to the center of the town of Annapolis?
Yeah, good question. So I am not familiar with Duke and Gloucester Street in Annapolis. That sounds like it's one of the main thoroughfares, but for sure this property is very close to the center of town in Annapolis, and I'm guessing Duke of Gloucester is one of the offshoots. So the Ferris property was just a block from St. Anne's Parish and Church Circle, which was sort of a major hub in the middle of town. It was a few blocks more to get from the Ferris household to the Annapolis State House, which still stands today. And it was a few blocks beyond that to get to the market space, the harbor where the ships would be docked. So I would consider the Ferris household to be really central to Annapolis in this early period. And today, when you're standing on that site, you really do feel like you're still in the center of town.
Thank you so much. I have to say, Holly, this really was, you brought history to life for us in so many ways. And I hope you can hear the virtual applause, because I know we're all cheering. This was really wonderful. So thank you again. And as I promised, there will be a recording, and we look forward to all of Holly's future endeavors with this. But seriously, thank you so much, Holly. And thank you all for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Ashley as well. Thank you, guys. Good night.